continue now with the lecture series, Paving the Path from Language to Literacy for Young Deaf Children. And we're going to continue on in talking about making language accessible. In the prior lecture, we talked about the critical role that language plays in the literacy development for all children, including those who are deaf. We also pointed out that this has historically been an area of challenge for deaf children, is making the language accessible. So this is where we're going to take up this topic and move forward and focusing on how to make the language accessible.
As we often argue, this issue of accessibility is fundamental. There's really no point in talking about anything else around teaching literacy, working on literacy, thinking about reading and writing development, if you can't tick off the language acquisition condition that the language is made accessible to children with hearing loss.
Connie often just says, you should just pack up your tent and go home if you don't have access to the language. And I think that that's just a good way to think about it. It's just so foundational, and everything we'll do going forward along this path.
It's predicated on the fact that you have been able to tick that box, that the language has been made accessible for the children. So the particular learning objectives we have for this presentation include explaining the importance of the access of a face-to-face form of English in early literacy development. And here we really want to underscore it's not just access to language, it's access to English language.
We also want to explore the differences between language and modality, because I think in our field they've often been conflated when we talk about particularly those children who use some sort of sign support along with their audition.
And then we want to identify different auditory and visual approaches that allow for making English language accessible for deaf children.
And particularly in this changing context that we talked about in our first lecture, recognizing the importance of hearing technology and as well as multimodal approaches to accessing English.
I mean, in the current context, there are very few children, and I mean, we stand to be corrected, but I think we would suggest there are very few children out there now that we're working with that can't make some meaningful use of hearing technologies. So that always needs to be taken into account now in terms of making English accessible. So back to the question, getting there from here, and just because it's to break things up a little bit, we thought we'd entertain you a little bit with actually my grandson, thinking about watching him develop as an early literacy learner. He's now 4, just had his birthday. So it's been fun for me to revisit that process with him and also to be able to capture some moments that maybe help make some of our points. And when you think about the fact that this little baby starts out, as we spoke about in our last presentation, from really no language and babbling to by age 4 already well on his way to literacy and reading and writing development. So just take a listen to this little baby and think about how we get there from here and on purpose here, because of course English is an auditory oral language, and the best way to get there from here is if you can exploit as much as you can the auditory potential that every deaf child has.
Are you saying good morning to everybody? Are you saying good morning? Yeah? Say good morning, everybody.
So now we've seen that cute clip of your grandson. It was adorable. So moving on to talking, to revisit some of the ideas that we talked about in the last lecture.
And this is just a little bit of a review or a reminder to say that this is not to say that we don't recognize a range of languages spoken and signed as legitimate languages, but we are here in this presentation talking about learning to read and write English so that it's the English language that needs to hold up the English literacy. And we're not talking in this presentation about Auslan or other natural sign languages as part of that mix. And the key issue that we're focusing on in this presentation is this notion of accessibility. So in other words, those 4 language acquisition conditions are all equally critical. We will be revisiting the other 3 numerous times over the next set of presentations. But for this presentation, we want to highlight this notion of accessibility and say the first business of any early literacy program from the get-go is making the English language accessible so that it can be acquired. If you can't tick that box, you can't move forward. It's fundamental. It's the fundamental first step in a reading and writing program. In the uni where I teach, I co-teach often with my faculty member who's an audiologist. And sometimes the students will say, we don't understand why the audiologist is involved in the language and literacy program. And what I say to the students is, but the technology is part of the literacy program. And getting that understanding behind notions of early literacy development, we would argue, is really important.
And because Connie's work has focused more on deaf and hard of hearing learners in terms of her job at her university, whereas mine is focused, I don't teach in a deaf education program, I teach in a learning disabilities reading program. This area, talking about accessibility and how we make language accessible to deaf students, is much more her topic, if you will. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to her until we start talking about some of the aspects where some of my work has focused. So I'll be rejoining a bit later.
So as we've said, the key issue in this presentation is how do we make the English language accessible to children who can't necessarily hear it as easily as hearing people do? Clearly there are 2 avenues for that. One is auditory access, and here's the deal. It's kind of this, it is just what it is. It's a fact that English is an auditory oral language and is most easily accessed if you can hear it. That's just how it is. So it's easier to acquire English and to learn to read and write if you can hear it. So clearly we want to maximize that for any child with hearing loss. However, it would be foolish for us to stand here and say that every deaf child now, technology is so wonderful, we're done, we've sorted it. Every child now has perfect auditory access to English. That is also not the case. We still need to consider visual routes to support English language acquisition. One way to think about this, if anyone kind of questions, well, you're making a lot of noise about audition. If one were to think about acquiring a natural sign language, if one had a vision loss, you can still learn to sign if you can't see. It's possible, but it's ever so much more difficult because sign languages are visual gestural and are acquired most readily through vision. Auditory oral languages like English are acquired more readily through the ears. That being said, auditory access is key, and we may be preaching to the choir here, but we just want to underscore that the use of hearing technologies and appropriate use of amplification is critical. They must be worn, they must be working, and they need to be properly managed. And as well, for all these children, right from the get-go, right from birth, to consider the listening environment. These are critical features if you want language acquisition to happen in the most efficacious way possible. And it sounds so dead simple, but as someone who's out in lots of schools and homes with parents, it's so much easier to write those points down than to make sure that the technology is on and working and consistently used. And that has become ever more challenging in this era of fast-paced technology. We were talking in the car on the way here about the fact that back in the day when we started, you could count on one hand the kinds of hearing aids you saw, and there was one kind of FM system, and it wasn't all that complicated to get sorted. Now teachers and parents are faced with a fast-paced change in technology with different systems and FM systems and different hearing aids and implants and BAHAs. It can be overwhelming, but so it's really become a big part of our job as educators and then to support parents in being very capable managers of the technology so that it's on and working, allowing for the best possible auditory access that can be provided to children. Because for most of them now, it's at least some, and for many kids, it's a great deal. That said, it's also true that ears alone are quite often not enough. And even for us who are hearing people, we don't speak to people with our backs to them typically. We look at people because we all make use of visual cues in communication. So one of the things that we need to think about in terms of visual access that really, if you think about it, is kind of in the auditory oral world, it's not about sign language, but yet it's visual, is speech reading. I think in our conversations, I think you might call it lip reading here. I think we're talking about the same thing. But it's the patterns on your mouth when you speak in English. And speech reading can get quite kind of a knock, and people will say, well, it only represents 20% and you can only read so much. Go ahead and look at the literature. There are a lot of critiques of speech reading. However, the way I think we need to think about it, no one would ever do this. No one would ever do that. Speech reading always happens in concert of voicing and looking at facial expression as part of a multimodal input. So that if you actually attach speech reading to what you're getting through your ears, to the context, it can provide quite a good model of English for a child to gain access. So in other words, audition and speech reading together, each is greater than the sum of the parts. They make a package. And if I talk to you sometimes the best way for me is always when the children tell you how it enlightens them. I worked with a student who, it was back in the day when I didn't always remember to sign and speak at the same time. And he would smack his hand on his thigh and go, "Move your mouth." And I said, "Why? What's up with that?" And he said, "Watch." And this is the example he gave, and it's brilliant. This is the sign he used, and this is the sign in ASL for guess. But he said, "Watch, Connie, watch." And he said, "This is guess, but it's also assume, and it's also estimate. Guess is 1 syllable, assume is 2, estimate is 3. You can disambiguate and find the English word by looking at the lip pattern. Is it perfect? No. But it's a heck of a lot better than nothing by not putting anything on your mouth. It's on your mouth where you find the English. So the speech reading can absolutely support the spoken language stream. And just because funny stories are always good, although it can sometimes go wrong, and this is where print can help disambiguate further, there's a sign in ASL that's this. This is the sign that means too bad. So if someone's bothering you, or you're fed up, or you're not paying, just too bad, I don't care, too bad. This is the sign for T. I used to say to the children in the classroom when they were complaining about something, "I don't care, too bad, do it yourself, too bad." This young fellow wrote a story for me, and in it he said, "The teacher yelled, 'tea bag,' because when he speech read it, he saw tea bag instead of too bad." So we know sometimes speech reading isn't perfect, but I would argue that it can provide an avenue for access to English that can be underestimated. And what's brilliant about it is it works well in concert with the hearing technologies. So that means in our current context, it's a really viable route.
For some children who may need even more visual support for disambiguating speech reading, cute speech would be an option. Cute speech is a communication system that conveys spoken language using consonant hand shapes and vowel placements. Consonants and vowels are combined, so cueing is cued in syllables, and it helps differentiate speech reading. So, for example, the hand shape 5, which is produced with a flat hand such as this, produces 3 different phonemes. So the phonemes that are represented by this hand shape are f, t, and m. So the system has been created so that those 3 phonemes are very different on the mouth. So again, f, t, and m. So this kind of closes the space. It's going to be one of those 3 phonemes, not another phoneme, by using this particular hand shape. Similarly, hand shape 6, which is produced like this, represents the sounds l, sh, and w. So again, 3 sounds that are produced very different on the mouth. Vowel placements, there are several. I'm just going to give one example of touching on the chin. So when I touch on my chin with the 5 hand shape, it's neutral, so I can use it just to show the vowel. So aw, eh, and oo. So again, those sounds, when you're producing them on your mouth, look very different. Again, aw, eh, and oo. So I can do a word like to, or moo, or shoe by touching my chin with the various consonant hand shape. You can access charts on the National Cued Speech website for various languages, as well as they have some really wonderful videos about what cued speech is and how it is used. We want to show you a video from their series of children's stories because I think this really illustrates how cueing can be used to convey language, English language, at a conversational rate. Also, it helps with another important skill of rhyming. It makes rhyming visually accessible to deaf children. So again, my example of two and shoe, you will see the story of 1, 2, buckle my shoe. So you can support the notion of rhyming by not only through hearing it, but providing a visual support. So a child can learn that when you touch your chin, in this case, with two and shoe, that's going to show the rhyme. So again, the two children's stories that we'll watch are Little Miss Muffet and 1, 2, buckle my shoe.
Once you become a fluent cuer, you can share favorite nursery rhymes and stories through vision and audition with your children or students. Here are a few examples.
Little Miss Muffet. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider who sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. One, two, buckle my shoe. 1, 2, buckle my shoe. 3, 4, shut the door. 5, 6, pick up sticks. 7, 8, lay them straight. 9, 10, a big fat hen.
And I think one of the interesting things about cueing, as with speech reading, it works in concert with amplification or hearing technologies so that you can cue and also use the hearing technologies, and you're not having to choose one or the other, but they're mutually supportive. And even though cueing, certainly in Canada, we don't know the story in Australia, how widely it's used, there is evidence to show that where it is used, it's been quite successful in helping children on the path to literacy. Another way in which you can provide visual access to spoken English is through English sign systems. Now, these are different than natural signed languages such as Auslan or ASL. These are systems that were developed, created, invented, if you will, to represent or put English on the hands. And these systems are quite exacting in that they represent right down to the morpheme level every piece of sign on the hands. These are systems such as signed English, signing exact English. If you go to the C Center, which we've given you the link for here, you can find more explanation about exactly what signing exact English looks like. We're assuming there are comparable versions of this type of signing in Australia where you put English on your hands in some sort of signed English. So for example, if I showed you signed English, this little thing, this is the ish. So it is signing right down to the exact morphological markers. And interestingly, there are still some schools that use C as an avenue for presenting English on the hands. Also, fingerspelling is a means for putting English on the hands. We'll talk a little bit more about fingerspelling and its limitations in future presentations. And I know that your fingerspelling, I believe, is two-handed, and we use the one-handed version. In North America, just because you might find this interesting, it was a bit daft, I have to say, but I taught it for 2 years, so I can say that. We actually used the Rochester method, which involved fingerspelling everything you said. So you would fingerspell every word that you said all day long. The idea was that by doing that, you were providing visual access to English. It didn't work, and of all of the avenues that we're presenting today, it's the one that really is it's resting in peace. It did not do its job. That's not to say that fingerspelling doesn't give you some insights into English, but it doesn't work as a means for making English accessible for language acquisition. So what we'd like to show you just before we round up this segment of the presentation is a couple of very, very short clips that demonstrate the use of these systems, signed English, exact signing systems by 2 young children with very short clips just showing you what it looks like when you sign and speak at the same time. Because the key issue for using English on the hands in this way is that it's compatible with the use of hearing technologies and with spoken English.
I like my friends so much.
What is your favorite subject?
My favorite subject is doing science.
My favorite subject is math.
Ooh.
So now that you've had an opportunity to see C-Sign in action, we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, we'll be talking about another way to access English visually through contact sign.
And you'll find that this is quite different than the sign systems we've been talking about, but is also different than a natural sign language such as Auslan or ASL. So stay tuned, and we'll have more to say on that when we see you in the next presentation.